The population of Curaçao is only 150,000. For contrast, Hawaii's population is 9 times bigger, while Los Angeles is 24 times bigger. Shanghai's? Over 150 times bigger. Only a dozen or so years ago, the national team of Curaçao had been hovering around the 200th position in the FIFA ranking and had been losing to teams most fans had never heard of. Yet today, they're playing at the World Cup. How on earth, right? Well, it wasn't a coincidence. And it's not just because the World Cup was expanded. There were a couple of other factors, things that completely changed this national team. The problem is that most fans are not aware of the story behind their evolution. Back in 2013, Curaçao wasn't performing. They ranked 183rd in the FIFA ranking. They sat below teams like Laos, Guam, Belize, or Liechtenstein. We're talking about a team that was a laughingstock of the footballing world, an outsider that no one treated seriously. Curaçao miserably failed in the 2014 World Cup qualifiers. Managing to play competitive matches against other low-rated teams from the region like Aruba or Bonaire was considered a success. I don't think there was any hope that things would change. If someone said back then that Curaçao would play at the World Cup in a dozen or so years, people would kindly suggest that such a person ought to go to a nut house. The team lacked good players, the nation had a weak national league, there was no perspective. But that was also the moment when things began to change. The federation made a decision that would later change the history of the national team. They hired a man who'd soon find a solution to the problem that Curaçao had never been able to solve on their own. That man was Patrick Kluivert. The effects were immediate. Up to that point, Curaçao's qualifier runs were hopeless from start to finish. All of a sudden, they won the Caribbean Cup. Then they went on and qualified for the North American Cup, where they reached the quarterfinals, having been knocked out only after a heroic clash with the much higher rated USA. Even the bigger teams began to treat Curaçao with a little respect. Patrick Kluivert hadn't come to Curaçao to manage your usual national team. He was acutely aware of the fact that that small island wasn't going to regularly produce world-class talent. Too small a population, too few professional clubs, too little infrastructure. Kluivert chose a different path. Curaçao is a Dutch territory. There were many Dutch players who had Curaçaoan roots. That was like a cheat code for Curaçao. The Netherlands are one of the best footballing nations in the world. Over time, more and more Dutch players with Curaçaoan roots accepted call-ups from the national team. With each international break, the level rose. All of a sudden, Curaçao wasn't just another amateur Caribbean national team. It was now full of players raised by Dutch standards, often with experience in professional soccer. That was when things began to significantly improve. The remaining problem was that many Dutch players still weren't keen to represent Curaçao. Those players grew up in the Netherlands, they trained and built their careers there. Curaçao was merely a place they knew from family stories or holiday visits. The federation had to find ways to convince them that representing Curaçao made sense. Curaçao weren't anywhere near qualifying for the big competitions, so it was more about promoting national identity. The methods worked, and the Dutch players with Curaçaoan roots were becoming increasingly keen on joining the island's national team. The squad was growing stronger. Earlier, Curaçao had resembled the other Caribbean national teams. The squad was mainly made up of local players who were playing for lower level clubs. Suddenly, the situation turned on its head. Curaçao's squad had players raised in academies of clubs like Ajax, Feyenoord, or PSV, clubs that had produced world-class talent for decades. Just a few years ago, players like Tahith Chong, Richard Lee Bazoer, or Livano Comenencia had played in the Dutch youth national teams. Today, they represent Curaçao. The difference was colossal. The team that had always been tactically and technically a level or two below the opposition now had access to players used to the professional environment from a very young age. Of course, that didn't mean that Curaçao was now a global force, but it stopped being a team everyone expected to beat. And just as Curaçao was on the rise, FIFA became a sort of catalyst, something that lifted Curaçao even higher. In 2020, FIFA loosened up the rules regarding recruitment to national teams. That meant that Curaçao would recruit even more players raised in the Netherlands. The level kept improving. The pool of players to choose from got even bigger. The loosening of the rules didn't make a big difference for most nations, but for Curaçao it was revolutionary because their entire project relied on players raised in the Netherlands. Yet even all this wasn't enough to get Curaçao into the World Cup. There was still something else. Even the best projects won't guarantee qualification for the World Cup. In soccer's history, there were many national teams that had developed for years but never reached the finish line. And then FIFA raised the number of teams at the World Cup from 32 to 48. That made little difference for the big players like Argentina, Germany, or Brazil. They would always qualify anyway. But for teams like Curaçao, that was another revolution. Suddenly, teams that previously could only dream about playing in the competition now could actually have a go at it. Of course, Curaçao still were a long way from qualifying for the World Cup. They weren't exactly favorites in the qualifiers, but the chances were now much greater than before, and that was not the end of good news just yet. The world had one more surprise in store for Curaçao. The 2026 World Cup was hosted by the US, Mexico, and Canada. That played a huge role. All three countries qualified automatically for the competition and didn't have to participate in the qualifiers. And those three teams had usually been the leading forces of the CONCACAF zone, especially the US and Mexico. For decades, they had been regularly blocking the path to success for the smaller federations. This time, that wasn't the case. Three of the biggest contenders were out of the picture. The opportunity to qualify for the World Cup was right there in front of them. They just had to take it. Curaçao had been building on their foundations for almost a decade. First, Patrick Kluivert had arrived. Then more Dutch players had started joining the squad. Then the regional success came that showed that the project was working. And later, even FIFA had helped their cause with the relaxed rules and easier qualifiers. But all that was worthless unless the players proved their quality on the pitch. 70-year-old Dick Advocaat took charge of the team. Curaçao still weren't treated as a serious candidate for qualification, but many fans were looking at the project with a sense of awe. Sure, the squad was stronger, the results were better, but a decent contender in the qualifiers was still a long way from becoming a World Cup participant. That's why the qualifiers became the final exam. In the qualifiers, Curaçao, led by Dick Advocaat, looked like a hungry team that had long awaited their chance. They cruised through the second round. They played at a level that no one on the island had ever seen before. The team looked well organized, experienced, and aware of their strength. They won the group, claiming all possible points. In 4 matches, they scored 15 goals and conceded just 2. That wasn't luck, a coincidence, or a series of fortunate events. They were simply the better team. Curaçao didn't lose their heads in the last round of the qualifiers either. They were within touching distance of the dream. It was the 18th of November 2025. The final whistle blew. The players triumphed. The team representing an island with 150,000 people just achieved the impossible. They pulled off something that would stay in people's memories for decades to come. That's why Curaçao's journey sparks the imagination so much. It reminds us that soccer doesn't only belong to the biggest and the wealthiest. You don't always need a bajillion large population. You don't always need a budget like that of a Premier League club. You don't have to be Brazil, Argentina, or Spain. In an era when many wealthier and bigger teams often disappoint their fans, Curaçao's journey reminds us of something simple. Sometimes all you need is a good plan and the right people who are genuinely willing to carry it out. Imagine this, 150,000. Fewer people than in the 180 biggest US cities. Only a few years ago, the 183rd team in the world, now a World Cup participant. And that's exactly why Curaçao's journey is one of the most incredible stories of modern soccer. No one is surprised when Germany, Brazil, or Argentina qualify. What makes the tournament more interesting is when teams like Curaçao do. Their qualification is a reward for their hard work on a long-term project. A good idea triumphing over wealth.